text I have chosen this morning is from Ezekiel, chapter 16, verses 6 to 7. I was tempted to look for another text, to walk away from the rather lurid description of Israel, first as an abandoned baby, and second as a beautiful and beloved woman who turns to prostitution. There is a good precedent for this. One of the leading sages in Judea in the 1st and 2nd centuries advocated very strongly for never reading chapter 16 in public or translating it. But I stuck with Ezekiel for 3 reasons. The first is that abandoned baby, powerless and helpless, rather the way we feel during the pandemic. Our lives are precarious and we are powerless. Also, that abandoned baby represents a break in the story. It's not what was supposed to have happened next. A newborn baby is supposed to be wrapped, put into loving arms, taken care of, not abandoned in an open lot. And so many of our stories have been disrupted by COVID. The matric dance that was supposed to happen next hasn't happened. Small children sitting in a classroom and learning to count and to read hasn't happened. Funerals where people gather to grieve together, to comfort one another, haven't happened. Our storyline has been pulled right off the rails by the pandemic, and we have no idea what will happen next. But the most important reason I decided to stay with Ezekiel was the prophet himself, a prophet speaking into catastrophe, which I think is very relevant to our times. This is what the introduction to the book of Ezekiel says in the Message interpretation. Among biblical writers, Ezekiel is our master at dealing with catastrophe. When catastrophe struck, it was the 6th century BC invasion of Israel by Babylon. Denial was the primary response. Ezekiel saw what the people with whom he lived either couldn't or wouldn't see. God at work in a catastrophic era. People in denial refused to see that the catastrophe was in fact catastrophic. How could it be? God wouldn't let anything that bad happen to them. Ezekiel showed them that yes, there was catastrophe, but God was at work in the catastrophe, using the catastrophe. He showed them so that they would be able to embrace God in the worst of times. People in despair, overwhelmed by the devastation, refused to see that life was worth living. How could it be? They had lost everything or would soon: country, temple, freedom, and many, many lives. Ezekiel showed them that God was and would be at work in the wreckage and rubble, using the disaster to create a new people of God. God's people emerged from that catastrophic century robust and whole, and the reason, in large part, was Ezekiel. So the message of Ezekiel is God with us, but not just God staying with us, God working with us to shape what happens next, even if it's a long time in the future. This month is Compassion Month in the Anglican Church, and just as God is with us in the catastrophe, in our despair, in our denial, in our rage and grief and fear, God is with us as we respond compassionately to the results of the catastrophe. We don't have to do this on our own. We don't have to feel overwhelmed or reach for resources we don't have. We don't have to exhaust ourselves. We have to work with God and measure our responses the way God measures, which is not the way the world measures. We don't have to measure our compassion only in material terms of food and clothing and shelter. Something that is quite trivial in material terms may be really important in somebody's life. Ezekiel's dreams were important for what happened next. A new Jerusalem did arise, and it was shaped to a large extent by Ezekiel's words and visions and dreams. And so our response, our compassionate response, we do in harmony with God's will, using all of our resources, dreams, words, and material resources. Amen.